Jamila couldn't go to her business the next day because she was still ashamed and embarrassed after Mugo beat her up at her place of business near their house. She stayed up all night crying, her pillow soaked with tears. By morning, her eyes were swollen, her head throbbed, and her body ached from the bruises she had sustained. The news of her ordeal had spread all over the neighborhood like wildfire. Jamila could already imagine the whispers and pitying glances she would receive if she stepped out. Meanwhile, Mugo acted as though nothing had happened. He got up, dressed for work, and left the house with his usual arrogance, humming a tune as though he had no care in the world. His casual demeanor infuriated Jamila even more. How could he be so heartless? Didn't he see how broken she was? At about 10 a.m., Jamila's phone rang. The sound startled her. She had been sitting in silence, her mind racing with thoughts of escape. It was Cece, her best friend. Jamila had been planning to call Cece for help, but it seemed Cece had beaten her to it. Jamie, Cece's familiar voice came through the phone, filled with concern. The moment Jamila heard her best friend's voice, she broke down again. The sobs came in waves, her body shaking as she let out all the pent-up pain and frustration. Cece stayed silent, allowing Jamila the space to cry. After a few moments, she spoke gently. "I'm here, Jamie. Tell me everything." Through tears and hiccups, Jamila narrated the events of the previous day. Cece listened intently, anger simmering in her voice as she responded, "This can't go on. Jamila, you don't deserve this. What do you want to do?" "I have decided to leave this marriage and start a life on my own," Jamila said firmly, though her voice trembled. "I can't take it anymore. I'm scared of what he'll do when he finds out, but I'm determined this time." Cece's voice was steady and reassuring. "You're doing the right thing, Jamie. I'll help you. Let's plan this carefully. We can't let him suspect anything." They discussed a plan. Cece suggested finding a simple accommodation in another neighborhood not too far, so Jamila could rebuild her life without completely losing her connections. They would also secure a small space where Jamila could continue her foodstuff business. Everything had to be done quietly and gradually. Jamila began taking small, deliberate steps toward her freedom. Each day, she hid away small amounts of money from her business, tucking it in a spot she knew Mugo would never check. She spoke with Cece regularly, coordinating their plans and discussing every detail. Yet, every move felt perilous. Her heart would race whenever Mugo was around, terrified he might discover her intentions. One evening, Mugo came home earlier than usual. Jamila had just finished hiding her savings when she heard the door creak open. Panic gripped her. She quickly composed herself and went to greet him, forcing a smile. Mugo's sharp eyes scanned the room. "Why do you look nervous?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Nervous? No, I'm just tired," Jamila replied, her voice steady but her heart pounding. Mugo narrowed his eyes but said nothing. He seemed to sense something was off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Jamila exhaled silently when he finally moved to the sofa. As the days went by, the tension in the house grew thicker. Jamila's fear of being discovered was almost paralyzing, but her determination to escape was stronger. She kept her movements cautious, ensuring Mugo never had a reason to suspect her. Yet, there were close calls. Once, Mugo found her phone open with a message from Cece on the screen. She quickly grabbed it, laughing nervously. Cece's just being her usual chatty self. Mugo stared at her for a long moment before shrugging it off. The days turned into weeks, and Jamila's resolve grew stronger. She began to notice small changes in herself. The timid, obedient woman who had lived in constant fear was slowly being replaced by someone braver, someone willing to take risks. Yet the questions loomed. Would her journey to freedom end in triumph or tragedy? Would she finally escape Mugo's shadow, or would he find a way to tighten his grip and pull her back into the thick darkness? Mugo, on the other hand, was becoming suspicious. He noticed Jamila's quiet determination, the faint spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before. It unsettled him. He couldn't place his finger on what was happening, but he knew something had changed. And Mugo was not the kind of man to let change happen without his approval. One evening, as Jamila prepared dinner, Mugo sat in the living room, watching her closely. "You seem different lately," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "What are you up to, Jamila?" Her hands froze for a moment before she forced a smile. "Nothing, sir. Just trying to be a good wife and mother," she said calmly but sarcastically. He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Good. That's what I like to hear." But the look in his eyes told a different story. He didn't believe her. The tension in the house grew thicker with each passing day. Jamila's every move was now under scrutiny, and she had to tread even more carefully. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, she refused to give up. Her children's laughter reminded her of what she was fighting for. Their future depended on her courage. Mugo's elder brother, Sali, and his wife had always been kind to Jamila. They knew all that she had been going through in her marriage to Mugo. They silently wished that she could summon the courage to leave with her children. Jamila visited them one evening out of the love and respect she had for them to inform them of her decision to leave Mugo. She told them it was a big secret and they couldn't tell anyone, not even Mugo. They were excited at the news and promised to support her where they could. As the set date for the plan's actualization approached, Jamila slowed down on restocking her shop. Mugo wasn't aware because he hardly went to her place of business. Meanwhile, Cece worked tirelessly behind the scenes. She found a small, affordable apartment in a quiet part of town and negotiated the rent. She also scouted locations for Jamila's new business, ensuring it was a place with good foot traffic, but far enough from Mugo's prying eyes. The night before Jamila planned to leave, she barely slept. Her heart was heavy with a mix of fear and hope. What if Mugo caught her? What if she failed? But then she thought of her bruises, her tears, and her shattered dignity. She couldn't stay. She wouldn't stay. On Tuesday morning, while Mugo was preparing to leave for his taxi business, the atmosphere at home was not suspicious. Jamila prepared as though she was heading to her place of business as usual. Mugo, not knowing what was about to happen, left for work. Jamila carried just a few clothes for herself and her two kids so that no one would suspect a thing. Cece had told her where to meet up. She would take Jamila to the new apartment and stay there with them for 2 days before returning to her own house. As Jamila stepped out of the house for what would be the last time, she felt a liberation in her soul. She took a deep breath as she made her way to the road to board a taxi to meet up with Cece. They met up and headed to her new apartment. She was so excited. The house was not much, but she would finally have her peace of mind. Cece arrived shortly after at the place they agreed to meet. Jamila's face set with determination. "Are you ready?" Cece asked, grabbing one of the bags. Jamila nodded, her throat tight with emotion. As they flagged down a car, she felt a strange calm rush through her heart as they took off. This was her chance to reclaim her life, and she wouldn't miss it for the world. The journey to the new apartment felt like an eternity. Jamila's nerves were on edge, and she kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting Mugo to appear out of nowhere. But they arrived safely. The apartment was small but clean and cozy. For the first time in years, Jamila felt a glimmer of hope. Mugo came home that night and found neither his wife nor kids. He was furious. At first, he thought she was still selling at the shop. He drove down there, hoping to start another serious scene and beat her up mercilessly. To his greatest amazement, the shop was closed. He was surprised. Where is this woman, he wondered. I will teach her a good lesson once I find her. He asked her neighbors at the shop, and they told him she hadn't been to the shop that day. He was surprised. Did something happen? He called her phone several times but couldn't get through to her. She had changed her mobile number. He called his elder brother, Sali, but he denied having any idea of her whereabouts. He had no one else to ask because he had made sure she had no friends. He also couldn't ask Cece because they had never been cordial. The first 2 nights were beautiful because Cece stayed with them and helped her settle down into her new home and environment. The day Cece would leave finally came, and it was emotional for Jamila and her children. Cece grabbed her hands. You're stronger than you think, Jamie. We'll figure this out together. You're free now, and no one can take that away from you. As Jamila hugged her best friend, she felt a spark of hope reignite within her. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she believed she could make it. She had escaped the darkness, and now she was determined to embrace the light. After a week of settling in, Jamila resumed her business in her new shop. She was so happy in the new neighborhood. It was an opportunity for her to start a new life and make new memories for herself and her 2 children. The following days were filled with cautious optimism. Jamila settled into her new space and began setting up her business. She worked tirelessly, determined to rebuild her life from scratch. But she knew the danger wasn't over. Mugo would come looking for her. She had to stay vigilant and ready. Many months passed, and Mugo was unable to make contact with Jamila and the kids. Initially, he wasn't too bothered because he had been enjoying his extramarital affairs with the young girls who lived around. After 5 months, he was bored because he had no one to bully. Jamila cannot embarrass me like this and get away with it, he said with fury in his eyes. He resumed his search and got a lead from someone who saw Jamila one time on the road. The person described to him the area where he had seen her. He started frequenting the area to ask around and see how he could trace them. After about 3 weeks of thorough search, he found them, but he deliberately did not make direct contact. He went back home to strategize on how to publicly humiliate Jamila for this gigantic bold step she took to embarrass him. He then decided to get a small house in the area on short lease in order to be close to them. Jamila was unaware of all these. He thought to stay close to them and disturb the new life that Jamila and her kids enjoyed. Jamila was at her small shop, arranging goods on the shelves when suddenly, standing in the doorway was Mugo, her estranged husband. Her chest tightened at the sight of him. Memories of his cruelty and anger flashed through her mind, but she forced herself to stay calm. Masking her fear, she straightened up and faced him, her expression steady. "What do you want, Mugo?" she asked. Mugo, on the other hand, had a completely different demeanor. He wore a disarming smile, but Jamila knew better than to trust it. "Jamila," he began, his voice soft and pleading, "I have come to ask for your forgiveness. I know I've made mistakes, but I've changed. Please, let's start over. The children need their father, and I promise to do better this time." His words might have sounded sincere to anyone else, but Jamila wasn't convinced. She had lived through too many broken promises and too many nights of fear. "Mugo," she said firmly, her voice steady but polite, "I've moved on. You can see the children whenever you want, but I can't go back. It's over, Mugo's expression darkened. The sweetness in his voice vanished, replaced by a storm of anger. Without another word, he turned on his heels and stormed out of the shop. Jamila watched him leave, her heart heavy. She knew she had done the right thing, but she also knew Mugo well enough to sense that this wasn't the end. Weeks went by, and Jamila tried to focus on her new life with her children. She worked hard to provide for them and create a peaceful home. But one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the world grew quiet, her peace was shattered. It was late when Jamila heard a loud knock on the door. She hesitated, glancing at her children, who were busy playing as they got ready for bed. Something about the knock sent chills down her spine. Taking a deep breath, she went to the door and opened it slightly. To her shock, Mugo was standing there. His face was shadowed, and in his hand, he held a machete. Fear gripped her, but before she could react, Mugo shoved the door open and barged in. "What are you doing here?" Jamila stammered, her voice trembling. But Mugo didn't answer. His eyes were wild, filled with a madness she had never seen before. Without warning, he raised a machete and swung it at her. The blade cut deep, and she fell to the ground, screaming in agony as blood poured from her wounds. Her eldest daughter ran to her, trying to shield her mother, but Mugo's rage knew no bounds. He struck the girl on the head, killing her instantly. The screams and chaos drew the attention of the neighbors. They rushed to Jamila's house. But by the time they arrived, Mugo had fled into the darkness, disappearing into the nearby bushes. Jamila lay bleeding on the floor, barely conscious, while her youngest child cried uncontrollably beside her. They rushed her to the hospital and took her daughter to the mortuary. Meanwhile, Mugo, hiding in the thick bushes, was overwhelmed by the weight of his actions. Fear and guilt consumed him, and he dialed his elder brother, Sali. "Brother," Mugo's voice cracked over the phone. "I've made a terrible mistake. What have you done?" Sali asked sharply. Mugo couldn't bring himself to admit the full extent of his crime. Instead, he begged Sali to come to his hiding place alone. Sali, sensing something was terribly wrong, agreed but decided to take precautions. Before heading to the location, Sali called Jamila's phone. A neighbor answered and explained everything that had happened. Horrified, Sali immediately went to the police and reported his brother's actions. Together with the officers, he set out to meet Mugo. When Mugo saw Sali approaching, he stepped out of his hiding spot, expecting help. Instead, the police surrounded him. Shocked and betrayed, Mugo yelled at his brother, but Sali stood firm. "You need to face the consequences of your actions," Sali said, his voice steady but pained. Sali's decision to hand over Mugo to the authorities came at a cost. Their parents and other siblings turned against him, accusing him of betrayal. But Sali knew he had done the right thing. Someone had to break the cycle of silence that allowed such horrors to continue. Back at the hospital, Jamila was fighting for her life. The doctors worked tirelessly to save her, but the physical and emotional scars ran deep. She mourned the loss of her daughter, and the trauma of that night haunted her. Jamila's story is one of survival, but many women across Africa are not as fortunate. Domestic violence continues to claim lives and shatter families. It is a silent epidemic that thrives in the shadows of shame and silence. Communities, families, and governments must come together to raise awareness and protect women and children. Campaigns, stricter laws, and support systems are crucial to ending this cycle of violence. No one should have to endure what Jamila and her children went through. It's time to speak up, act, and ensure safety for every woman and child. Thanks for watching.